Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lucinda Vakura, Senior Director of Business Development and Marketing with Alfred Group. My pronouns are she, her, and I am wearing dark rimmed glasses and a dark black turtleneck. I have short brown hair and a blurred white background. Thank you so much for joining. Our event today is titled Strength-Based Messaging, How to Accelerate Impact Through Inclusivity. And before we dive into the content, I want to walk us through our land acknowledgement, a little bit about Alfred Group, and some logistics, some housekeeping items before we get started. So many of you know Alfred Group, and you know that we serve clients across the country. We have consultants across the country, but our headquarters is in Chicago, Illinois. So I'm going to read the land acknowledgement for Chicago. Chicago is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also called this area home. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. As I said, many of you are familiar with who we are, but in case there's anybody who is not, Alfred Group is a full-service national equity-forward consultancy serving the nonprofit community. We have 6 flagship services that you can see here on your screen. They include fundraising, strategic planning, leadership development, interim staffing, data management, and diversity, equity, inclusion services. We are a proud partner and sponsor of AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals. We are certified women's business enterprise and a proud member of the Giving Institute. Of course, you can find more information about who we are and what we do online. Our website is in the bottom right-hand corner, alfred.com. And before we dive into the housekeeping, I want to say this webinar today is part of our fall webinar series. And we are happy to host a free webinar series for a number of different topics. So if you enjoy today's webinar, which I hope you will, please register for the next 2. The next one coming up is on November 15th, Demystifying Cryptocurrency, How It Works and Why It's Important. If you're curious about cryptocurrency, this webinar is for you. If you're not curious about cryptocurrency, this webinar is for you. So, all things crypto, we'll talk about on November 15th. Capital campaigns will be on December 8th. The 4 things you need to have in place before you launch. So if you're thinking about launching a campaign in 2023 or even 2024, now's the time to start that planning. And that's what this webinar is all about. And you can find more information and register for both of those at the link here on your screen. And then finally, the housekeeping items and some logistics. So today's webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a copy of the recording within 24 hours of today's event. We'll send you an email with that. In that email, you'll also receive a survey. It's a really short, quick 4-question survey for us to collect feedback on how we did today. So we encourage you to share your thoughts and take the survey as well. Everybody today joining is in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. However, we do want this to be interactive and dynamic, so the chat is open. We encourage everyone to use the chat function to talk with each other and amongst yourselves. In fact, if everyone could just pop in the chat to kick us off, who you are, your organization, where you're from, just to say hello. And we'll bring the presenters on and we'll have a fun, dynamic conversation today. However, if you do want to ask a specific question to the presenters, we encourage you to use the Q&A function, which is an icon next to the chat. And that will help us track the questions, and we'll answer as many as we can as we go, but we definitely have time at the end for a formal Q&A. So we will answer all of your questions during that time as well. And then finally, join us on Twitter. We'll be live tweeting throughout the event today, and we hope that you join the conversation there as well. So with that, I want to turn things over to my colleagues, Leva and Mariah, to kick us off and introduce yourselves and start the conversation today. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. And it's such an honor to be here with everyone. We're so grateful you're choosing to spend your time with us today in this really important conversation. Again, my name is Leva Hendren. Leva rhymes with diva. I'm a senior consultant here at Alfred Group. She, her. Today I'm wearing Alfred orange, and I have a plain white background behind me. I actually have my degree in literature before moving into strategy consulting and the nonprofit space. And one of my very first projects was ghostwriting books for the Rockefeller Foundation Centennial Campaign. So really thrilled to be learning and talking about this important piece with you all. Mariah?
Thanks, Leva. I love when you mentioned that part about yourself and your work history. That is just so super cool. I'm Mariah Hickey. I'm a senior consultant at Alpha Group. I use she, her pronouns. I have long light brown hair. I'm wearing an orange shirt and a black blazer. And I'm sitting in a hotel room in front of a lamp and a framed photo. I've been with the consultancy for 4 years, and prior to joining Alfred Group, I was at the Pittsburgh Foundation in Donor Services and Development while I was in graduate school. And before that, I had studied journalism in undergrad, and I've always found joy in storytelling, both verbally and visually. And I really believe in the incredible power of effective and strength-based communication, which is why I'm especially excited about today's topic. And we'll hear from Aditi and Dana, who you see their pictures on the screen a little bit later, and hear about, their background and the value that they're going to bring to our conversation today. But first, Leva and I want to provide a bit of an overview for you. But before we do that, we do have some poll questions. So like I mentioned, Leva and I will provide an overview, and then we will open it up for a panel discussion with Aditi and Dana. And we will open it up for Q&A toward the end of today's session, but please use the Q&A feature, and we will try to answer questions live time as they come up. So don't feel like you have to save all your questions until the end. And then Lucinda will come back on and wrap us up. So this is the poll question I was so anxious to get to that I forgot about the agenda slide. But you should see a poll question, the first one, pop up on your screen. If you could just tell us what your main job function is, that would be really helpful. Great, I see these coming in. A lot of annual and individual fundraisers out there. A lot of marketing and communications folks, some grant writing folks, a few institutional fundraising and special initiative fundraisers. Oh, we have a good amount of others. I'm so curious, if you feel comfortable, please send in the chat what your main job function is. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, this is exciting. Okay, I'm seeing executive director, stewardship manager, philanthropic advisor, corporate relations.
All of the above. I love that. As nonprofit professionals, we wear all the hats, right? Managing events.
Wonderful.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Lucinda, could we move on to the second poll? Okay, so the next one should have popped up on your screens. About how much time do you spend on writing and communications? Wow, it's really looking like even across the board here. about 25% for each category. Okay, great. Well,
Wow.
we love to see this, and why we wanted to see this and really get a feel for who's out there is because communication is part of all of our jobs, right? Whether it's writing or verbally. And so that's why today's webinar is so important and why Leva and I are so excited to share with you what we've learned.
Thank you so much, Mariah. And it seems like this topic will be very relevant. So again, want to invite comments along the way. Just wanted to start with a brief overview of what is strengths-based messaging writ large. It's messaging that invites readers in towards a vision for change, reframes challenges as opportunities, invites people into a shared understanding of redefining success by building on strengths and positivities, and counteracting the brain's negativity bias, and building bridges by focusing on alignment and consensus building rather than focusing on differences. And some of the background behind this, Martin Seligman is often considered to be the founder of positive psychology, which then has been translated into organizational theory as appreciative inquiry approach, where we're asking questions and framing conversations from a place of appreciation to ensure that people can bring their whole selves, their best selves. Are coming from a positive and supported place rather than a place of negativity, which I'm sure many of you know. The negativity bias is very real. Our brains are designed to pick up on any negative or threatening cues, but often in today's workplace, it can become detrimental. And so as we move forward, we love the strengths-based messaging approach because it really engenders a group flow state and invites wonderful brainstorming opportunity. Mariah, would you share a little bit more about how we apply these principles in client work at Alfred Group?
Of course. Thank you, Leva. So you might have heard of a SOAR analysis framework that stands for strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. Unlike other frameworks, SOAR really marries up fact-finding about your organization and position in the marketplace alongside the desires of your stakeholders. So while a SWOT analysis, which I'm sure you've all done or at least heard of or are familiar with, while that SWOT analysis looks at where an organization is, a SOAR analysis really strives to be forward-thinking to address the potential and the possibilities of an organization. I think this is such a refreshing change from other frameworks such as the SWOT analysis because the SOAR really does focus on those possibilities, while a SWOT analysis is driven by competition. And by eliminating weaknesses and threats, SOAR does focus on the positive elements that are more likely to be influenced by the organization. SOAR also incorporates a level of accountability, as you can see here in the R section. So the results by addressing the metrics, which will be identified and then tracked through this process. Alfred Group, as Leva mentioned, uses this framework really as a launch pad for developing a number of materials in strategic partnerships. So we use it to inform our messaging work, such as case documents, donor materials, and then of course we love using this for launching strategic planning services as well. And an important note is this framework can really be used broadly for an organization as a whole, such as strategic planning, for example, or it can focus on a specific program or project. So for example, we can use this to inform key messages of a capital campaign. And with that, I wanted to pass it back over to Leva to talk more about Leva, if you don't mind, to kind of narrow down this strengths-based messaging and how it applies specifically for the nonprofit sector.
Thanks so much, Mariah. Exactly. So as we're thinking about strengths-based messaging, it's really important to apply it to the nonprofit sector because it's a little bit, it can be different and have its own applications. And I'm going to lead by being vulnerable here and sharing, even as your panelists today, that applying strengths-based messaging to the nonprofit sector can truly be a challenge because you don't want strengths-based messaging to be so positive that you're glossing over real challenges and differences and that you're not acknowledging that. So it's really important. There is no perfect in this work. There's always striving, and it's definitely a balance. But a couple of these guiding principles and lights that help us based on work by Prosper Strategies and Donald Millard's Story Brand, we want to make sure that we're engaging the people with whom we work and centering their voices. Strengths-based messaging in nonprofits honors and appreciates diverse identities and is always making sure, how did they want to be represented in communications? Are we being faithful and true to that? Are we really listening and using their words? So this gives us an equity-centric approach, allowing our language to be empowering and respectful by describing people how they want to be described, describing communities in a way that focuses on self-direction and really paints the possibility for what could be when needs are met, opposed to driving with needs-based messaging. And we'll share some examples very soon. So always want to make sure we're watching out for stereotypes, trying to counteract that, and avoiding heroism or saviorism language. So that instead of positioning saviors as the heroes, we want to make sure we're positioning the people served as heroes in their own story. That is a big difference. And with that, why are we even spending time talking about strengths-based messaging today? It's because your words really matter. Language has power. Words can hurt, offend, and provoke, but they also have the power to uplift, inspire, and change your culture, whether it's your team, your organization, or your community more broadly. So the way that we talk about things really influences emotional responses, our thoughts, shape our beliefs, and ultimately our actions. And that's why we're so passionate about this topic today. Now, Mariah, could you give us a couple of pointers on how we can take this theory into our actual messaging?
I would love to, Leva. Thank you. So we framed this as a say this, not that, and you'll hear from our panelists later about creating your own say this, not that for your organizations out there. These are just some samples that we came up with that really we felt exemplify what strength-based messaging is all about. So first, as Leva alluded to, it's really important that we are talking about the people that we serve using person-first language. So what does that really mean? And what does that look like? So an example of this is the first one that you see here. So in the left side column, these are all the needs-based ways of describing people that we serve. On the right side, it are strength-based frames for describing the same people. So for example, rather than saying an addict, person with a substance use disorder, or mentally ill, person living with a mental health condition, or person with a mental illness. So again, it's really important to use that person first language and uplift the people we're serving so that they are the heroes of their own story, as Leva mentioned, and is also why we have created those that through line of the women superheroes throughout these slides. We love those visuals, and we're hoping that you're enjoying them as well. But it's really important that when we talk about people that we're serving, that we're discussing the conditions that people are experiencing versus describing them in that way. It's also something that, is best practice with strength-based messaging to follow individual preferences and to be specific. So as Leva mentioned, this isn't always easy. There isn't always a right answer. for the now. And so what's most important is that we're really listening to the communities we serve and asking them how they like to be referred to or how they like to be described. Let people describe their challenges and abilities in their own words and then use that. And that can change as well. So just understanding that this is dynamic and understanding that it is very important to engage the communities, which brings me to our next fun little exercise here. And Leva, please help me with this one, but we really, really want to hear from you about how the people that you serve like to be described is number one. And then number two is, how do you know? How did you learn that they like to be described that way? And Leva and I will be, please put that in the chat. Leva and I will be monitoring that. And we're so excited to learn from you and hear what you're learning out there and using in your organizations. And I know we're putting you on the spot here, so don't be shy.
Neighbors with research from the National Network. That's wonderful. Lucinda, if you could go back to the previous slide, directly asking exactly. We just saw in the chat that we don't know how the young people we serve would like to be asked. I really invite you, if you haven't engaged in that work yet, to use this as an opportunity to practice empathy and put yourself in their shoes. And then, of course, perhaps you can have some listening sessions or some thoughtful conversations.
Residents versus leaders. And I think that's a really great example from Katie there in the chat that, we can't just assume that the term leader is something that everyone wants to be called or referred to as, right? And that's why it's so important that we're asking the individuals that, are the heroes of the stories that we're uplifting and that we're telling as part of our organizations.
Gina just elevated an example of finding the right terms from client feedback and talking about people with criminal records as individuals with justice involvement.
Mm-hmm. This idea is still very new to some organizations and many organizations. Morgan, you are not alone. And our panel is going to talk about some of the ups and downs of starting this conversation in your organizations.
Mm-hmm. And survivors of domestic violence rather than victims. Thank you for sharing that, Kathy. These are so many wonderful examples. And we wanted to make sure that you had these top of mind before we got in with our panelists so that you have opportunities to continue applying this work as we move forward in the discussion.
Great. Well, Leva, I'm just dying to know, how can we apply this to our work? What are some steps that we can do right now?
I'm so thrilled that you asked. Absolutely. So you can create a Say This, Not That guide, similar to what we just shared. It can be in any shape and size, but always getting out a Word document and starting is the best step. You can conduct a full communications audit to really revamp your messaging or review your style guide if you have one. If you haven't yet had the opportunity to ask how your clients like to be described, you can develop that type of a plan, and you can hire counsel to conduct a SOAR analysis, as we shared earlier, or assist in any of this work. You can research language trends with some of the examples we've given you, like the free resources available from Prosper Strategies. And we at Alpha Group will be sharing a link to one of our recent blogs as well. And with that, we would love to give you some examples from people who have been forging the way ahead in such a meaningful way our wonderful panelists today. And I'm going to invite them to join and introduce themselves, starting with Aditi, please.
Hi, my name is Aditi Desai. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Food Bank of the Rockies. Prior to joining the Food Bank, I was in the environmental conservation field for about 12 years. And before that, I actually worked at a variety of more grassroots local nonprofits, including at a women's nonprofit in New Jersey, which really shaped the way I do the work I do today. So I'll share a little bit more about that later.
Thank you, Aditi. We're so honored you're here with us. Dana?
And just sorry, one more thing I wanted to share. I have black hair. I'm wearing a gray sweater, and I have a black shirt with gold polka dots on. I'm in my office in Denver, Colorado, where it's sunny and really nice today. And I have a Food Bank of the Rockies box behind me, and that's what we usually distribute food in.
Beautiful. Dana?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Dana Textoris, and I am calling in today from Cleveland, Ohio, which I will say is also quite sunny and lovely. So very happy to be joining you all. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing a navy jacket. I have long brown hair and a blurry background, let's just say. I got my start in nonprofit fund development in a role that many of you shared today that you are in. I was a grants coordinator for a youth serving organization in Oakland, California, and later moved into roles as a development director and director of major gifts for the ACLU of Northern California and NARAL Pro-Choice California. 10 years ago, I decided to move home to my Cleveland hometown. And soon after, I joined Grants Plus. And Grants Plus is a consulting firm that, like Alfred Group, works with organizations across the country. Our focus is exclusively on helping organizations be more successful in finding and pursuing grant funding. And I've had the pleasure and challenge of working with awesome organizations over these many years. And I recently stepped into the CEO role to lead our next chapter beyond our first 15 years into a new future. So really excited to share with you how we're deploying strength-based language at Grants Plus.
Thank you so much for being here with us today, and congratulations on your transition, Dana. Would love to kick it off with a question for both of you, beginning with Aditi. Why is it important for nonprofits to implement strengths-based messaging?
So in 2021, Food Bank of the Rockies went through a full rebrand process. And that really started with our CEO, Aaron Pulling, doing a listening tour with other senior staff and talking to donors, volunteers, hunger relief partners, staff, board members to really assess, was Food Bank of the Rockies being as impactful as it could be in the community? How did our core community want us to show up in the community? How could we do better? And so for us, a key learning from that was really trying to find ways to center community in the language we use and the visuals and the storytelling, and really, identify new values, create a new mission statement that aligned with our aspirations of being an organization that promotes inclusivity, diversity, equity, and really, really focuses on collaborating and innovating, centering community. And so that started with that listening tour, and that actually predates me. But what I love about it is what you've already shared earlier in the presentation. I can't stress enough how important it is to deeply listen. Not only go on these tours and take notes, but like deeply listen and reflect back what you hear through the work that you're doing, because I think that there's a level of integrity that each of our organizations has and respect for individuals and empathy. And I think if we don't, live those values and align ourselves with those values, then the trust that needs to be there to do good work is just not there.
Thank you. Dina?
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate hearing Aditi's perspective from a single organization. I think what really resonates with me is something that we see too. The reason that strength-based messaging is important, one, is because it does demonstrate values of integrity, respect, and empathy, as Aditi said. And that alignment that an organization can better have with its values is going to end up allowing it to craft more precise, more persuasive messages that are ultimately going to be more successful. The other reason that I think strength-based messaging is very important for us to address and to embrace is that it's not only about being successful in the short term with funders by having more powerful fundraising communications. It's also about shifting power dynamics that are inherent to philanthropy and that I believe are in the end harming more than they're helping organizations to access the funds that they need. And I think we have to look at why are we even talking about strength-based messaging? And the reason for that is that philanthropy itself traditionally is a very donor-centered experience where traditionally philanthropy has been this charitable benefactor and their experience, their identity as a donor, giving to beneficiaries who are in need. And if you have seen fundraising infomercials or opened a lot of your fundraising mail, you know that the more broken, the more hopeless that beneficiaries are presented, the more it's working. And what I would say, that's not working at all, that we need to really examine this kind of bedrock principle that we have heard for decades and decades of donor as savior, donor as hero. Because of you, donor, we are saved. Because one, it emphasizes an oversized place of the donor in the story. And it also ends up perpetuating a dishonesty between organizations who are trying to play that role and the real truths that then they're shielding donors and funders from understanding. So today I'm really excited as we get into this conversation to talk about, one, what are some very specific steps that organizations can take to deploy strength-based messaging in a way that does make their fundraising more effective, but also how can we approach this as a movement that is moving philanthropy into a more equity-focused direction.
Thank you so much, both Aditi and Dana. And Dana, I know we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of what you mentioned. But first, Aditi, I have some follow-up questions for you based on what you shared with everyone in terms of Food Bank of the Rockies' recent experience and rebranding in 2021 and Aaron, the CEO's listening tour. But before you made the shift, what was the reasoning behind this desire to shift your language, your visuals, and your storytelling? Was it an outside force? Did it come from within? Did it come from your partners? Tell us a little bit about, what made you start this process.
When we started down the path of listening to community members, we realized that we were not centering our idea of equity. Like, what does equity mean? What does access mean? How do we share stories around that? How do we make all of the work we do inclusive, including our language and the way we tell stories and share stories? And so for us, it was a natural shift into moving everything towards person-first language. And again, it's such an interesting thing. And I think, Leva, you touched on this as well. Even though we rebranded in 2021 and this process actually started in 2019, we are constantly adapting our language. And so a word we used yesterday is not going to be a word we might use tomorrow. And so it's a continuous process. But I think the main emphasis was based on really wanting to be a part of the community in the way that felt natural, organic, authentic, but also very much not a savior approach, very much that we are also part of the community. We wanted to shift away from any sort of language or emphasis on othering. And a lot of that comes down to also many of our staff members, including donors and volunteers, have lived experience of food insecurity. And so I think you all touched on this before too, but the idea is that any of us could be food insecure at any point in our life. And in that position, how do I want to be approached? How do I want to be treated? Am I any different from a person working within the food bank versus somebody who's living in the community and coming to a distribution? No. So that connection, that bridge is really essential for us in doing our work in a way that has integrity and ensures that everyone who works with us, regardless whether they're coming to a distribution or volunteering with us, understands that we are here to work with them in a way that's dignified and respectful and honest. And so a lot of the times, the work that we do, we craft the language together because enough of us have had different forms of lived experience to better understand how we want to be spoken to. And so that's also a big emphasis for us, not only to go on these listening tours, but also a big emphasis for our HR department is really hiring from within the community, just so that we can really reflect back the needs better, the values better.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm curious, and you mentioned several ways that you really developed the messaging. Can you expand a little bit on, who was involved in developing this message and who continues to be involved as you adapt it, like you mentioned that you do?
Absolutely. So when we first started down this path, we started working with a agency that helped us, drill down into who are we? Like, how do we want to present ourselves in the community? And so we came up with a mission statement and a new set of values with them. And the values were very much, again, oriented around innovation, collaboration, service, and integrity, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we really use those values as a jumping off point for everything else. And we worked with them hand in hand to come up with a person-first language guide as part of the transition. We have a brand guide. We really rethought the way we have stories on the website. Who are the stories about? How are people being centered in the stories? What kind of photography are we using? I mean, it was a very granular process to ensure that everything we put out is something that we can feel really shows the community in the best light possible. And so originally, when I first joined, some of the photography was very much around individuals who looked downtrodden, and our language was very much around highlighting folks in the community, not as people who are currently facing food insecurity, but the hungry. And so as part of this process, just from our work with this agency, but also the listening tours, and then many of us having lived experience, that really helped us move forward in a way that is much more respectful. And I'm happy to share some of the things that we created along the way, if that's helpful.
Yes, please do. I was just going to ask, can we see these amazing pieces that you're referencing?
Yeah, so as part of anyone who's been through a rebrand process knows it's a process. And so as part of that, we created this one pager for all staff to really highlight that even though we were the same organization, we were still laser focused on getting food out into the community. There was a strong reasoning behind our change in mission, but I think there was concerns around just changing so drastically. Our logo had been well known in the community for a number of years. We're a very well-known organization in the Rockies. And so there was natural concern around, well, how is this going to impact how people view us in the community? How is it going to impact donors? And so as part of this process, staff was very concerned. We ended up coming up with this one pager that really talked through some of the reasoning and the new ways we were talking about ourselves. And we also did presentations with all staff and volunteers just to ensure that they felt connected to the changes and it wasn't something that was being done in an office by one person. And so we went through a pretty broad process to make sure that that everything we did was inclusive. In addition to that, we wanted to have resources available to everyone so that they could see, you know, okay, what does this mean? How are we changing things? And so we created a brand guide that's pretty long, but it's great because there's a table of contents and it goes through everything from the illustrations we created that we wanted to be very inclusive, but also our change in photography. And actually some of my team is on this call, which is great. But we've really moved towards photography that highlights the work that's being done in the community, but also is very respectful of the folks we work with in the community. And so it was a major change for us. We redid the website, everything, including our annual report, the blog, everything is centered around this new approach. And we really wanted to bring people on the journey with us and ensure that the changes reflected our new values, but also made sense to them. In addition, we created a style guide. Again, our tone is hopefully very friendly and relatable and accessible. And so some of the language we were using previously used more inside baseball terms like procure and things like that. And so we tried to move towards language that was much more approachable and inclusive so that anyone reading our work, whether they're familiar with food banking or not, would be able to understand what was going on. And I had the benefit of never having been in food banking before this position. And so I use that lens quite a bit to ensure that, you know, if I can understand it, hopefully the general audience could also understand it. And since these guides are quite long, we ended up coming up with a shorter language reference for folks who maybe didn't have time and who are still very forward facing in the community in terms of staff members and volunteers. And a lot of this terminology, again, changes week to week, month to month. And so for the longest time, we were using seniors, but then we talked to a lot of community members, including staff, and it did not feel like it reflected the community in the way that they wanted to be reflected. And so we really looked at other terms that we could use to ensure that folks, regardless of age, would feel included and talked about in a respectful manner. And healthy was a recent one too. We have a bunch of different programs and nutritionists on staff, but the word healthy can be very loaded and it can be different culture to culture depending on dietary needs and foods. And so we've actually stopped using the word healthy in much of our work as well. And so again, this is you know, constantly changing. I just actually asked for an update on some of these terms, and so we'll be getting a new guide soon. But it was an interesting process, and I think we used when I started working through this, you know, it felt very daunting. It was like, how am I going to work within an ecosystem that's been in existence for over 40 years. Our organization is going to be 45 in 2023. And so I, you know, started like anyone these days, I Googled and I was like, hey, like what's going on with language? You know, what are other organizations doing? And so being a part of this feels like a really nice honor because I feel like it's kind of that next step because it took us, you know, so long to be able to create these resources, and it feels nice to share with folks who might be on a similar path to us.
That's great, Aditi. And I just have a quick follow-up question for you, and it came through in the Q&A as well. So I think it's burning on everyone's minds. And then we have some questions for Dana. So if you could keep it brief, that would be great. Did you receive any pushback when you were rolling this out from donors, from staff members, board members, and then how did you overcome, you know, some of that pushback?
We did, I think we realized pretty early on that for an organization of our, I guess, our age and standing in the community, that we might have folks who might not be aligned with the same values that we were going to move forward with. And so we've had donors off ramp with us, but we still decided to move forward with this because we knew that we wanted to align all of this work with our values. And by the same token, we've actually had new supporters join our efforts, seeing what the work we're doing in the community, seeing how we really want to show up in the community, and the fact that their values might align with the values we've adapted and adopted to in the last couple of years. And so I think that there's always an inherent risk of losing support. At the same time, we wanted to remain true to the mission.
Aditi, thank you so much for sharing that. It's a really important point that's top of mind and dovetails with our first question for you, Dana. Earlier at the top of this panel, you suggested that strength-based language isn't just about doing the right thing, it's also an avenue to raising more money. Dana, would you say that nonprofits might be hesitant to move away from typical fundraising messaging, particularly in grants, that might be more donor-centric to a strengths-based approach?
Sure. I mean, of course, I can understand where there might be some hesitance. And I think there is an opportunity, though, to address how using strength-based language is about writing a couple of things. One, it's about moving away from a deficit-based way of talking about people, but it's also about moving away from a deficit-focused relationship between nonprofits and funders. I talked a little bit ago, and we talked about how the donor is hero kind of frame is centering the donor. And when we talk about incorporating a strength-based approach, we are talking about changing the terms of engagement. And that is scary because strength-based messaging demands that we move to decentering the donor and recentering an organization and its community. And I saw a question come up in the chat about, what do we do if, how do we challenge external partners to adopt this when they resist? And I don't know if that questioner was referring to external partners as in funders or as in community organizations. But either way, we have to acknowledge that, of course, there is some risk in making this change and decentering the donor. And that means that organizations might have to make choices. That starts with knowing your funders, having relationships, and knowing where you may have funders where you can engage in more honest conversation, and where you may have funders where your values are so misaligned that you might have to face decisions about funders or partners that you let go. And I recognize that puts many organizations in a very challenging position because, that one grant, that one gift can make a very big difference. But I'd encourage organizations to weigh that risk against the reward. And I think the reward of moving towards strength-based approach is about bringing a more honest light to what we are sharing with funders. I think, if we examine, for example, the language that we use, whether in grant proposals or funder appeals around gratitude, your $100 gift or your $10,000 grant fed the community. I think we can examine that and recognize that there's some exaggeration in that. There's some sugarcoating that does present a little bit of that in service to that donor-centered approach, this exaggerated sense of what the donor has made happen. What if we were to present a more nuanced expression of gratitude? Because this isn't about not thanking donors, not thanking funders, not recognizing how they play a role, but to do so in a way that is proportional. So instead of, your $100 fed the community, how about, your grant was very useful to help us achieve X, Y, Z in this narrow slice of our work. But without more flexible funding to maintain our staff, we aren't able to offer this program at all. So I think moving away from a donor-centered approach to an organizational strength-based approach includes incorporating more of the realities that organizations are dealing in, and inviting funders and donors to participate in a bigger context, to involve them in understanding that, yes, while this gift or this grant may be helpful, moving towards real solution requires that we acknowledge all of the needs that organizations have. We move away from this idea that they can operate on slim margins, and we create space for something else that is crowded out. When we only center donors, we are not centering community members. We are failing to recognize, to your superhero motif, other heroes of the story. In that, if we talk about donor as hero, the flip of that is beneficiaries who are helpless. Well, we know not only is that disrespectful, we know that that is not true. That those who engage in the services or the programs of our organizations are doing so with great effort. They are manifesting change in their lives. And we can tell a richer story by incorporating those voices, those stories, and those perspectives in the words of our community participants.
Thank you so much, Dana. That's really helpful and important context setting and aspirational. I'd like to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up for our Q&As. We have some great Q&A questions, but could you give us 1 to 3 specific recommendations that you might advise to nonprofits for employing strength-based messaging when grant seeking, particularly in light of strict character limits, as Ashley asked in the chat?
That is the question of questions. So I think one thing we can do is we can ground ourselves in acknowledging that these last few years have introduced a moment of opportunity and change. When the pandemic started, for example, funders did something that nonprofit organizations had been waiting for a long time. They said, largely across the board, what is it that you need? And organizations responded and shared the real needs, the real realities, to stay operating, to address the most urgent needs in the communities. I think it can be difficult, but I think organizations have to make courageous choices to vocalize those real needs, to be willing to test and try to change the rules of the game, to be more explicit in describing to funders not only their successes, but their challenges, so that organizations and their funders are acting as true partners in solving those challenges. A second piece, I think, is to invest in creating a strong general operating proposal. Every organization, when you ask what they need general operating funds, they need flexible support. So let's invest in articulating not what is aspirational and what you could do with funding. What are you doing now that reflects what you have assessed and identified as the highest priorities? That includes an articulation that your organization's ability to make this needed change in the community will come from investment that enables them to be stable, strong, to take care of staff, to depend on infrastructure, that is how organizations can be true anchors. So, investing that time yourselves, engaging support like that we can provide at Grants Plus, creating core narratives that demonstrate what your organization is doing and how flexible support can be part of that. And then thirdly, let's look to other leaders in the community. We have an opening where we have leadership from people like April Walker, who's the founder of Philanthropy for the People. We have the community-centric fundraising organization and website that helps us see, let's disengage from routines that reinforce the wrong messages. including flouting how much organizations are able to to succeed on slim margins. Let's start celebrating the funders who are giving you general operating support. I think by moving to a strength-based approach in the ways that demonstrate the strengths that organizations and their funding partners can have together, can shift norms and move us in the direction of healthier dynamics.
Absolutely. That's positive psychology at its best. I love that.
Thank you. Well, we have a great question that came in from Katie that I'd love to pose to you, Aditi, and to you, Dana. But their organization just rebranded as well. And it, of course, affects every aspect of their language. One thing that they have made an effort to do is incorporate community voice more. So her question is, how are you doing this? And how do, and maybe Aditi, this next question specifically for you, how did your team have the bandwidth to juggle this work and also weave in enough time for being in and authentically listening to your community? And then she just made a note that this is from a 2-person marketing and communications team. So a small, but I'm sure mighty team.
So when I joined Food Bank of the Rockies as well, it was a 2-person team. So I can fully understand the challenge of bandwidth. And one of the things that we really tried to do was, my background is storytelling. And so we really wanted to focus on how can we tell authentic stories, interview folks in the community in an in-depth way that also honored them and their voices. And so we tried to focus on doing that type of storytelling and then using the same story across multiple platforms many times over. So we really tried, if we were going to spend time doing this type of work, we wanted it to be feel good to the people that we were working with and communicating with, but also knowing our own bandwidth, we wanted to ensure that the story had long legs. And so we ended up sharing that story. If it was a single story, we'd share it on the blog. We'd do a different version of it for our annual report. We do a different version of it for maybe grants. We do a different version of it on social media. So we really tried to focus on finding great, impactful, inspirational stories within the community, but also ensuring that we were able to share that story many times over so we could get traction with that story and make sure that we're using our resources the best that we could. I also started working more so with vendors in the community and hiring freelance writers just so that we could if we've found a good story, but our team wasn't able to make it, that we could send somebody there to really, and do a great job with an interview and share back a solid story. So if that resource exists, I'm hopeful, hopefully that exists for you, but I know it can be very challenging.
Well, thank you. We are just so grateful, Dana and Aditi, for your time and for joining us and for sharing all of your learnings in this space with our audience. So thank you. I'll invite Lucinda to wrap us up.
Wonderful. Great. This was fantastic, everybody. Thank you so much. What a great conversation. And thank you to everyone who participated in the chat. What a wonderful, wonderful dialogue. Just a couple reminders before we conclude here today. Just a couple of really quick things. This is the second webinar in our series. And the next 2 webinars, one is coming up on the 15th, Demystifying Cryptocurrency and Capital Campaigns on December 8th. Here's the link to register. So please do so if you found this helpful. I'm sure you'll find the other ones helpful as well. A couple of reminders, this has been recorded and we will send you a recording via email within 24 hours. Also in that email, you'll receive a survey to provide us with any feedback from today. We'd love to hear your thoughts. It's very short, it's 4 questions. And after we conclude here in a minute, you'll also be prompted to complete the same survey. We appreciate your feedback. And finally, our contact information. If we have not answered your question, or if you have more questions or want to continue the conversation, which we are very open and welcome to, please send us an email at info@alford.com. It's the best way to get a hold of us. So with that, thank you to the panel, Leva, Mariah, Dana, and Aditi. Thank you to all of the participants. This was a really wonderful conversation. We'll be in touch soon. And with that, we're going to conclude today's session. And I hope everyone has a really great day and take care. Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Happy November.